John, and I'm going to do a little presentation on freediving. I was going to do it on diving in general, scuba diving, freediving, saturation diving, all that kind of stuff, but actually as soon as I got into it I realised there was enough there that was interesting about freediving and we'd stick to that. So as a start, we get into the ancient history of freediving. Generally it's assumed that people have been hopping into the ocean, grabbing fish, shellfish, pearls, things like that for as long as we've been living. But the earliest history that we have in terms of concrete evidence is the Chinchorro people of Chile. So around about 6000 BC, we have carbon dated bones that showed something called surfer's ear. So repeated exposure to cold water creates little bone spurs growing in your ears, so something that you might know surfers will get. That'd be the first evidence that we definitely have. Obviously back in those days and until really quite recently, free diving or diving at all was something that was seen as a profession. So in those days, hunter-gatherers, people may well have been jumping into the ocean for fun, but for the most part it was to get themselves sustenance and what they needed to live. You'll see in quite a few of Homer and Plato's writings mentions of bathing sponges. So they would have been gathered by divers who would tie stones they found at the seaside around their waists, dive down to anywhere between 10 15 meters, grabbing sponges, dry them off, and that's an example of those with an 1800s diving suit beside it. So I'll hop to the next slide for me there. Again, as freediving became something that was actually a recognised profession, around about 200 to 500 BC, as more and more wars tended to start happening in the Mediterranean, trade routes became congested, you had a lot of ships being sunk along those trade routes. You'd find ships with gold, weapons, different valuables, so professional divers became fairly popular. During the siege of Tyre in 332 BC, Greek divers were sent to cut the cables of Macedonian warships in the middle of the night, leaving a good part of their flotilla to float off into the moonlight. So, one of the most famous and interesting groups of people in the world, in a similar way to how the Sherpas of Nepal have adapted to the high altitude, the Bajau people, they're a semi-nomadic people. They're a group of a few different ethnic groups. It's quite a vague collection, but they live on houseboats, very rarely at land. They tend to move from place to place. They free dive most of their days catching fish and shellfish. Now, the divers within the community spend literally up to 60% of their day not on the water, but underwater. So they might spend 6 to 8 hours actually underwater. It depends on who you talk to, hundreds or thousands of years of diving has led to an actual physical evolution. So it's not that say you're born and you get quite fit and strong and used to being underwater. They're measurably different to the average human. The biggest difference they have is their spleens. So their spleens are about 50% larger than a normal human being's. Underwater, the spleen acts as quite a big reservoir of heavily oxygenated blood, so under pressure that gives them an extra reservoir of oxygen to keep them underwater for longer. One of the things that proves that this isn't just an adaptation that you make within your own lifetime is the fact that diving and non-diving Bajau people have the same adaptation in their spleens. So it's one of the most interesting evolutionary adaptations that humans have made in terms of possible medical uses. Having more research being put into this, there's thoughts that could be quite helpful. They can dive unassisted to over 70 meters. That's something that you would not see outside of professional freedivers anywhere else in the world. So yeah, interesting folks. I'm going to move on a little bit for me there. That's a picture of some modern freedivers, and we'll pop on straight to the next slide. So, one of the most important factors in freediving and underwater submersion of any form is called the mammalian dive reflex. So, before 1949, scientists assumed that if you were to dive past 30 meters of depth, you would die instantly. They assumed because of Boyle's law, which basically says that as the pressure of a gas as the volume of a gas decreases, its pressure increases. They assumed that once you went beyond around about 30 meters, your lungs would be crushed. The way that the mammalian dive reflex works is under submersion, cold water contact triggers your trigeminal or your fifth cranial nerve. This then sends a signal to your vagus nerve, which sends a signal to your nervous system to slow your heart rate. So, main things that happen are bradycardia, which is a slowed heart rate, peripheral vasoconstriction, which is just a fancy way of saying that the blood from your extremities is sent towards your core and your brain. So your overall oxygen consumption goes down massively, your heart rate slows, your blood pressure decreases, and blood stays exactly where it's needed. So it's a response that's seen in every single air-breathing mammal. It's quite minimal in humans compared to, say, whales that could dive for 30, 40, 50 minutes to hundreds of meters of depth, but it's one of the reasons why freedivers can do what they do. So I'm going to pop on to the next one for me. So, freediving transforming from what it was in the past of being just a necessity into a sport. Before the 1930s, freediving was cold, it was miserable, it was inefficient. You didn't have fins, you didn't have wetsuits, you had masks, but the masks were an old style round mask that covered the nose and the eyes, so equalising was quite difficult. The 1930s, the development of different and new rubber compounds, a lot of this helped by wartime concerns, ended up making fins that would eventually end up with the carbon blade style fins we have these days, masks with a separate rubber nose piece so that you can equalise more easily, and weight belts that weren't just a stone tied around your waist. Then in terms of the cold, in the 1940s, the first neoprene wetsuits were developed. Most of them didn't make their way to the public for quite a while. The US Navy bought most of the supply right up through the 50s for the Korean War for the Marines. But in 1941, a man called Raimondo Boucher, he was an Italian-Hungarian Air Force captain. Himself and his friend lived near Naples. They'd go diving just for fun. One of the days he gave his friend a bet that he felt he could dive to the lung-crushing theoretical limit and back up. So for 50,000 lira or 1,200 euros today, roughly, he made that dive, which scientists had assumed he would 100% die doing. So this was kind of the turning point. At this stage, 30 meters, that was the maximum. He opened up a whole new world. So, one of the most important figures in freediving after Boucher was Bob Croft. So he was a US Navy dive instructor. He spent most of his time in pools training on rigs like this. So one of the most dangerous things in a helicopter is submersion. Helicopters have a tendency, as soon as they hit the water, because of the rotors on top, to flip upside down. So he would spend his time training folks on rigs like these. Now, these days, most of these guys will have scuba tanks. Those days, he did a lot of his work freediving. So he got very, very good at freediving. He also developed something called lung packing, which in hindsight seems very obvious, but he developed a technique of you take in breaths up until the point where you feel like you're completely full, and then force more and more and more air in to give yourself the maximum amount of oxygen you can. So, as it says here, encouraged by his colleagues, he was the first person to go beyond 67 meters on a single breath hold in 1967. Again, the 67 meter limit at this time, after the 30 meters, was thought again, okay, they thought, right, 30 we can do, 67 meters, you're going to die. Again, not the case. Within 5 years of that, someone had dived to over 80 meters. As you can see, the depth of the dives is increasing quite quickly. CMAS is the main governing body of diving and freediving. They refused to officially ratify any more records for about 15, 20 years. They were just, science was playing catch up, and they had no way of feeling that they could stand on two strong feet and say, cool, go for it, when they were in complete unknowns. So if you want to move on to the next one for me there. So, in terms of modern freediving, there are 3, maybe 4 main categories. The main one that's known is constant weight, which you have 2 categories, with and without fins. So you have a line from the surface down to either the bottom or the depth that you're intending to go to. You cannot touch the line, you can't grab onto the line, you can't pull yourself along the line. The world record at the moment is held by a guy called Alexei Molchanov, who we'll have a video about later, down to 133 meters. So it's the most physically demanding. You're kicking and finning your way down and up the entire time. One of the things about constant weight is the constant. That weight brings you down, you have to fin back up with the same weight on you, so that one's super tough. Free immersion, you pull yourself hand in hand up and down the line. It's a little bit less physically demanding. Divers say that it's a little bit easier to equalize as you go, but even still, it's still absolutely ridiculous. This one is held by Peter Klovar at 128 meters. Static apnea, that's what you're going to see on the top right of the screen here. Very, very simple. Hold your breath, lying face down in the pool for as long as possible. At the moment, the record is 11 minutes and 35 seconds. That's with no oxygen. There are unofficial records where you can breathe 100% oxygen before you do that. That becomes extremely dangerous. We'll talk about that in a minute. But officially, 11 and a half minutes. The next one then is dynamic apnea, which is total distance covered underwater on one breath. So you submerge yourself, usually done in a pool, and you swim from end to end, back and forth on one single breath. 301 meters, which is just unbelievable. I'm not sure exactly how long it took him, I can't remember, but you're talking maybe 6 or 7 minutes while swimming, if any. Then, in some ways the most exciting, but not sanctioned in competition, is no limits freediving. So they have something called a weighted sled. You get into the water, you have a 30 or 40 kilo sled, and you'll make it down to the bottom in 30, 40 seconds. Then for your ascent, you pop a massive airbag and you rocket back to the surface. So it's much less relaxing. Well, relaxing isn't a good word in freediving. There's no such thing. It's much less tranquil looking. It's just about hitting an ultimate depth.
And I look at the bends.
No, that's fine. That's a great question, and I'll actually come to that. Yeah, as you can see, 240 meters, 700 feet, absolutely unbelievable. So, next one there. The bends I will come back to. The main danger in freediving is called shallow water blackout. So, very simply, you pass out due to a lack of oxygen. The reason why is a concentration of CO2 in the body is what actually gives us the desire to breathe. So if you hold your breath, at some point you feel a strong urge. It's almost like your chest starts shaking and you need to take a breath. That doesn't happen because of a lack of oxygen. It happens because of an excess of carbon dioxide. So before a free dive, most people will hyperventilate. So they'll take in long, strong inhalations and exhalations, clearing out as much CO2 from their body as possible while bringing in as much oxygen as possible. One of the things that will happen, there's a thing called Henry's Law, which basically says that the amount of gas absorbed into a liquid is a function of the pressure of the liquid, or the gas on that liquid. So if you can think about it, that the liquid we're talking about is your blood, the gas we're talking about is oxygen. As you go deeper and deeper under the water, the pressure of that oxygen onto your blood is higher. So even though at the surface you have a given amount of oxygen, as you go down deeper, more of that can be absorbed. As you then come back up from your dive, that pressure reduces. The amount of oxygen available is super, super low. And because the pressure change is so quick as you go from 20 to 10 meters, the amount of oxygen available drops rapidly, while you have a very low amount of CO2 because of hyperventilation you're doing. So you could be feeling completely fine at 15 meters, completely fine at 10 meters, and in the space of 2.5 seconds, you'll completely black out. Now, if any of you here tried to hold your breath until you black out, you can't. Your body's going to tell you to breathe. Again, because of that CO2 concentration being so low, you'll pass out without ever having the feeling of the need to breathe. So, in terms of keeping divers safe, one of the good things at least is that this happens generally between about 6 to 3 meters. It's quite close to the top. So, in freediving competitions, you'll have safety divers stationed at different depths. One of the problems is those safety divers can't be scuba divers because, as Claudia mentioned, they can get the bends. So, as a freediver, you take one single breath, you bring that to the bottom, and you bring it back up. There's no change in the pressure of that air as you come back up. When you're breathing pressurized gases from a scuba tank, there's a huge amount of nitrogen in that gas that, as you breathe under intense pressure at the bottom, saturates your blood with nitrogen. As you ascend too quickly, that nitrogen quickly bubbles out of your blood, causes decompression sickness, or what people call the bends. So if a safety diver was on a scuba apparatus at, say, 10 meters, they can only ascend quite slowly. A free diver, on the other hand, can, as you can see in this picture here, grab an unconscious diver, they cover their nose and their mouth, they keep their head back, and they'll spin them to the surface. So the safety divers themselves are top-level athletes, and they'll be sitting there for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes waiting until the diver returns to the surface. They'll get them to the surface, tilt their head back, gently tap them on the cheek, blow on their cheek as well, splash a little bit of water on, and that will usually, in 99.9% of cases, trigger their urge to breathe again. So that's the main part of that. And then we just have a trailer for a movie called Freediving. So this is the no limits with the weighted sled.
As you go down and down and down, the heart rate starts dropping.
There's an astonishing amount of pressure exerted on the lungs.
You get dizzy and have visions that are not real.
Divers themselves very much downplay the danger of the sport.
I'm very competitive, always have been since I was a kid.
Alexei is the greatest freediver in the world. If Alexei can get all 5 world records within the same season, it would be something that's never been done before.
My mom was my coach since the beginning.
Natalia Molchanova is widely considered the greatest freediver of all time. She'd had 41 world records and 23 world titles.
They were like best friends, and now Alexei is training to follow in the footsteps of his mother. But that can be dangerous.
40 meters, 50, 100, 140.
Natalia was teaching in Spain and went down on a fun dive, and she didn't come back up.
And I was so surprised to see Alexei was competing.
I was thinking, oh my God, can you not take a year off or so?
That was his way to overcome the pain.
Alexei is going deeper than he has been before.
He's going too far.
Have you and your wife ever talked about what would happen if you come back?
No.
I don't understand the reasoning for adding 8 meters to a dive that you failed.
Expected dive time, 4 minutes.
Alexei doesn't see himself in any danger. But does that Formula One driver think they could die when they get behind the wheel? There are risks we are willing to take and we get comfortable with. And because of that, we think that we're immune to them. When you have this physiological ticket to eternity, that would be addictive.
Thank you. Perfect. You want to press I think there's one more.
Oh God.
And one more really important slide, yeah. Any questions or no?
You mentioned equalizing.
Yes.
What is it?
Yeah, I said that and didn't really. It's literally equalizing the pressure in your inner ear to the pressure that you're feeling from outside. So most people would do that by pinching their nose and squeezing like that. Most freedivers can do it through, I cannot remember the name. There's a reflex, there's a way of swallowing with the back of your throat. You can do it there. That does the same thing. But yeah, like for these guys, especially on the weighted sled, the speed at which they have to equalize is unbelievable. Otherwise, you'd perforate your eardrums pretty quick. But yeah, it's literally just that's it. Yeah, sweet.
Just about the mammalian type reflex.
Yes.
I've heard that humans can give birth underwater.
Interesting.
And babies can survive underwater for a few seconds or minutes, before they get to the surface. Just like you were saying about the mammalian reflex.
Holding their breath. Yeah.
I presume that's the same thing.
And this, because I think really freshly newborn babies are like ideal.
Yeah, exactly. They know how to breathe. Yeah.
They can survive underwater for ages.
Really?
It's only when you take them out of the water and they take their first breath, they can't go.
Oh, they can't go back down, right? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Have you watched the deep